We're wrapping up the box office look for James Gunn Superman movie, and on the one hand, there are some things about this movie and about the box office performance so far that suggest that things are going good for it. But on the other hand, there are things going on with this movie that suggest that they still have some trouble ahead of them right now. I have this article pulled up from Deadline right now that kind of breaks down what it actually made at the box office throughout its opening weekend. So the headline, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's a box office hit. Superman opening to $123 million, Sunday AM update. So when I talk about whether or not the movie is going to be a success for the studio, because James Gunn previously said this isn't a movie that needs to make $700 million in order for it to be a success. Now, how does he define success? We don't know. He never mentioned it or anything like that. When I talk about whether or not a movie is successful at the box office, I'm talking about whether or not the movie actually reached profitability for the studio. Now, even if a movie doesn't reach profitability at the box office, the movie can still recoup some of its revenue elsewhere through licensing deals, merchandising, and other things like that. So just because the movie doesn't make money at the box office doesn't mean the studio lost money on that particular movie. It just means it's going to take a little bit longer before the movie becomes profitable for the studio. Maybe that's what James Gunn's referring to. I'm not referring to it. So if you're upset about my assessment on this one, just understand that's what I'm referring to when I say it's looking like there's going to be a little bit ahead of this movie before it actually is going to be profitable. And right now, looking at this opening weekend, even though it's nothing necessarily terrible, it doesn't look like it's going to be something that's going to reach profitability for the studio at the box office. So Warner Brothers execs have every reason to be doing the crypto doggy dance this morning, as it's the studio's second $100 million plus opening this year after a Minecraft movie, $162 million. Technically, Warner's owns the number 1 and number 3 biggest openings of the year. Currently, Warner owns number 1 opening year to date. So they're talking about Minecraft and Lilo and Stitch are number 1 and 2, and Superman is number 3 highest opening for at the box office this year, which that's obviously something to be proud of, and I'm not taking that away from them because this movie could have technically opened up much worse than this. Some of the projections that we've seen so far for this movie were as low as $90 million opening. I've seen them also as high as $145 million opening. So $123 million opening weekend for this one is kind of in line with what we've come to expect from when it comes to this movie. And when you look at it in conjunction with the other movies in the franchise, it's pretty solid, at least as far as a singular Superman movie, where like on Batman v Superman, for instance, that had a bigger opening weekend than that, but that's also a Batman movie too. So just treat it as if like a standalone Superman movie. And one thing that a lot of people are pointing out is this had a bigger opening weekend than Zack Snyder's Man of Steel when that came out back in 2013. Now, of course, you can always adjust for inflation and other things like that. And if you adjusted for inflation, right now it's reported on the numbers that they have a similar production budget at $225 million. I personally doubt that's the case for James Gunn Superman. I'll get more on that in a moment. But so when you adjust for inflation for Man of Steel, they spent significantly more on that movie than James Gunn spent on this movie, if you actually believe these numbers. But adjusting for inflation, it also had a better opening weekend. But I don't even think you need to adjust for inflation to get that Man of Steel had a better opening weekend than James Gunn Superman. I have this article right here from Forbes, date of publication, June 16, 2013. So came out right after Man of Steel opened up a weekend box office. Man of Steel sourced to $128 million debut. Now, you might be thinking, why does it say $128 million on this article? And then when you look at the numbers, it says it only had $116 million. And that's because this $116 million reporting is only for around the 3-day opening weekend for this Meanwhile James Gunn Superman movie. If you recall, they had the early previews, I believe on Tuesday, and then they were showing it on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So you get the idea. They had more days to actually generate revenue, and that's what's being reported right here on going under the opening weekend. And if you actually just looked at it, apples to apples comparison of just like the Friday through Sunday, Superman, James Gunn Superman made less than what Man of Steel made. Here's scrolling further down into this article from Forbes. Man of Steel debuted this weekend for a 3.25 day total of $128.7 million. And what they're talking about is on the the Thursday early preview showings for Man of Steel. If you count that whole figure as its opening weekend, then it's not only trumps the $116 million debut of Alice in Wonderland. So talking about other movies at the time. Here, let me just scroll further down in here. But if you just count the $116.1 million Friday through Sunday total as its opening weekend, which I generally do not, that puts Man of Steel above the $110 million debut of Toy Story 3 for the June weekend record and ahead of Alice in Wonderland's 116. So other figures at the time, but for the sake of what I'm trying to get at in this video, they're saying that Man of Steel had $116.1 million for just Friday through Sunday. If you count just early previews as well on that, then they made $128.7 million. Meanwhile, you can go back to James Gunn Superman, and not only did they have early previews on Tuesday, then they had an extra day or so of revenue. They made $122 million. So less than what we saw with Man of Steel. And when you look at the final box office results for Man of Steel, 667, or let's just round it up because it's close to that, $668 million. That wouldn't be good for James Gunn Superman if it actually only made that amount, because that was a financial failure for Warner Brothers at the time, given the production budget and how much they were able to generate at the box office. But for them, they still greenlit it for a sequel because they were looking at it kind of as an investment, so to speak. And that's also a reason why James Gunn could be saying that it doesn't necessarily have to make its money back in order to be considered a success. They saw when it came to Man of Steel that it was good enough of a performance where like this could justify us launching our entire shared universe off of the back of Man of Steel. I mean, we saw how well that worked out for them though, but still they probably thought it was successful enough for them at the time. And you kind of look at it as an investment. You're going to buy your product and then sell it later on. So that initial investment, you're going to be out at the start of everything. But then once things get going, then it can kind of build off of itself. And then you can be like, okay, what we started with and what we initially spent, it was worth it in the long run. And I think they saw that with Man of Steel. And that's why they might get to that point when it comes to James Gunn Superman too, because if it was able to generate around the same amount as Man of Steel, then maybe they would say that's good enough. I personally, like I said, don't trust this production budget. We saw enough reporting with official tax filings that suggest that they spent north of $300 million on that movie. James Gunn and the studio tried to deny that, but they also have an incentive to try to downplay how much they spent on it because it kind of lowers the bar for success for them. James Gunn then further lowered the bar of success because it's like, okay, well, you didn't spend $350 million in the movie. You spent $225 million. That would mean the movie needs to make around $700 million at the box office in order to be profitable for the studio. And James Gunn saying like, no, to be successful, we don't need $700 million. So he keeps trying to downplay how much they actually need to make in order to become successful. But if it was, like I said, if it was $225 million they spent, then it does need to make around $700 million at the box office in order to be successful. Looking at what Man of Steel did during its opening weekend, according to the numbers here, that was around 40% of its entire box office gross was made during that opening weekend. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've seen with James Gunn Superman. So right now they've made $217 million. If you take 40% of that, if this is like 40% of their entire box office revenue is made in their opening weekend, similar to what we saw with Man of Steel, then that would mean they would end up just shy of $550 million at the global box office, which would actually be pretty big loss for this movie. Now, if they actually do have a pretty decent box office hold, because superhero movies or big budget superhero movies like this tend to make between 30 and 40% of their entire revenue at the opening weekend. So if their opening weekend is more closer to that 30% mark, then that would mean they would probably end up around $723 million at the global box office. Movies with a huge hold at the box office and have some legs underneath them might actually see something around 20% of their entire revenue was made during that opening weekend. And if that was the case, this would make close to $1.1 billion at the global box office. Now, movies usually only have holds like that if it's some type of cultural phenomenon, if there's nothing else on the horizon for it to compete with it, and this is just a movie that people say you have to go watch in theaters, then you'll get those kind of numbers. But I don't think we're going to get that. But seeing as how Man of Steel wasn't well received with audiences, it was just kind of meh with audiences, and James Gunn Superman is a lot more better received, then I think it's going to be not necessarily around the 40% during its opening weekend. I think it's probably going to be closer to the 30%. I think it might actually have a decent hold at the box office, especially next week since there's not much coming out. Now, the week after that, that's where the real fun starts, because then we got Fantastic Four coming out, and that's pretty much a direct competitor with this sort of movie. So we'll see if that kind of takes a lot of the wind out of the sails for Superman. And if that's the case, then we could see it actually make most of its money during its first couple weeks and then kind of drop off a cliff, especially if Fantastic Four turns out to be really successful. But if that movie just kind of flops, and if everyone hates that movie after the opening weekend, then I think Superman will have some life left in it. And it's probably going to make a little around $700 million at the global box office if that turns out to be true. But time will only tell. Until then, though, we can just go by what we've seen so far and what we've seen in the past. And while these opening weekend numbers aren't necessarily the greatest thing for them, it's also not necessarily bad news either. But let me know what you think about this in the comment section below. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest entertainment news. And don't forget to click that like button and share this video out there, because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.